Welcome to Transform Now, a podcast focused on intelligent automation and brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. On this program, we talk about how organizations globally are rethinking the way they operate, utilizing process orchestration and AI-enabled digital workers to free up humans to do the work that matters most. We also share insights and tips on how you can embrace this new way of working and unleash your full potential. Let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Our guest on this episode is Ema Roloff, co-founder and principal consultant at Roloff Consulting. Ema is very vocal about educating executives on critical importance of digital literacy, easy for me to say, and people-driven change. With a rich background as a high school teacher and over a decade of experience guiding companies through their digital journey, she brings a wealth of knowledge and perspective. So you got some passion in terms of the way you approach your business, but I'm sure I didn't cover everything. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
You did a good job.
So how did you make the transition then from teaching into, which I guess it's about the same, you teach children, teach executives about the same level?
Yeah, I would say so. I always joke that I'm still teaching. I just teach big people instead of little people now. But I guess high school's not really that little. But I went to school to be a teacher, and I would say that this story is pretty indicative of what our business has become and what my husband and I launched. So back when I graduated from college, I had the opportunity to do corporate training internships while I was also student teaching. So I had like the public school side of things along with private corporation like training. And I was actually in the franchise, like restaurant franchise space. And so I had the opportunity before I even applied to any teaching jobs to go into corporate training. And for anybody that knows what it's like to be a teacher and have a lot of student loans, there was like a little bit of a math equation that went into the decision to step away from teaching, at least initially. But also there was when I got a little bit of a spark for business when I was in that initial internship and realized that there was all this stuff that was just never really presented to me as a job option. I was smart and talkative and I liked presenting and I liked kids. So I was immediately shoved into teaching growing up. And I think there was never really any room for me to think through, is there a different path that I'd like to take? And when I found out that, oh, I actually do like business, I thought, I've got a teaching certification. I can always go back to it. So why don't I try this and see what happens? And so I made the move into corporate training and was in that role for a couple of years. And then I was ready to make another transition into technology. That's about all I knew that I wanted to do. My husband was the head of sales and marketing for a web development firm, so he was working in technology. My dad actually worked for the same franchise that I did in IT and was, again, like on the technology side. And so when I was looking for position change, I was like, I want to go into technology training. And at the time, I joke that my husband and my father-in-law and my husband's uncle did an intervention with me on Thanksgiving. And they said, why don't you try tech sales instead, or sales in general, rather than going into training again? And at that point, sales was a little bit of a dirty word to me. And the idea of doing that sounded really not appealing. And this is really the kernel of what our business is now. But my husband looked at me and he said, the best salespeople are teachers. And if you can find a product and a company that you like feel comfortable standing behind, you're not going to have to sell anything. You'll be able to teach people about how you solve their problems. And that was enough to get me to apply to all of one sales jobs. And again, like the stars must have aligned or something, because the sales job that I applied for was with a process automation company. And the COO at the time used to work for IBM, and early IBM days when there were no technology degrees, they would go and they would recruit teachers from college campuses to come and join their sales team so that they could teach people about technology. So when she saw my resume, even though I met no qualifications for the job except for having a 4-year degree, the fact that 4-year degree was in education was enough for her to offer me a job. And then I got the bug and here I am.
I know a lot of the things you've been talking about online, because again, you are quite prolific in terms of some of the posts that you have on LinkedIn and YouTube and whatnot. They revolve around this concept of digital literacy. And like you said, you're not new to this field, and your voice in the intelligent automation space is fairly clear. So, what do you think the biggest challenges are with companies trying to face this implementation of the technology? Is it really technical or is it cultural or what are your thoughts on that?
I think all of the above a little bit. So, the idea of digital literacy was really born from my own journey of figuring out technology. Again, I had no technology background, no sales background. And so, when I joined my previous company, Navient, and this was about 10 years ago at this point, I had to start from ground zero. And I've actually taken pictures. I've never made the post because I have to figure out how to take out any sensitive information on the pages. But I would have these notebooks that I would go into meetings with, and I would write down all of the acronyms or the things that I didn't understand. And I would star them or I would underline them. And I would do all of these things to try and signal to myself to go back and ask someone what the hell was happening in that conversation. And it took probably a fair year for me to get the lay of the land on the technology space, and then at that point, part of how I was learning was also trying to create content to help other people learn alongside me. And so before I ever started doing video content or anything like that, it was like doing webinars and writing blog posts in those early days about 10 years ago. And like things like the acronym guide of technology and these different things. And then that kind of always stuck with me that when I was selling, a lot of times before I could ever get to talking about the value of the solution, I had to educate my prospects on what we were talking about and what the art of the possible was. And around the time that COVID started, like everybody else, I was in a sales position. I had a quota I had to meet, and everybody's voicemail boxes were full, and people were not responding to emails because they didn't know what was happening. I hit this point of what am I going to do? All the things that I had done to teach people about technology and again, use this methodology that I had for sales disappeared. And again, another little, probably like little spot that if we were to make a map on our journey to opening our business, my husband and I were having a conversation about it. And he was like, why don't you try video? Like you like presenting. So try doing video and see if you can continue down that path. And then naturally over time, I started to recognize that the posts that I was creating and the content that I was generating that got the most traction were the ones that felt like were answering some of the most basic questions or breaking down these concepts that felt like native English to me, but for somebody else outside of the technology industry, it felt like I was speaking, Chinese. And so trying to figure out how to break down technology into, for lack of a better way of saying it, into an inclusive language. And I started to see that grow. And over time, I started to realize this is something that we don't do a good job of in the technology industry. And then alongside that, realizing that like when that knowledge is lacking at the top, culturally, it tends to be lacking throughout the entire organization. And there isn't necessarily a mechanism that's been put in place within companies to help support that type of knowledge and that kind of understanding across any level of the company. And then when you look at trying to actually accomplish things like digital transformation, you have these executives that have no idea what they're talking about, trying to set expectations and budgets and timeframes on these projects with these teams that don't know how to push back or say that doesn't sound right, or maybe fearful to say that doesn't sound right because they don't have a great way to set those expectations. And then you maybe have this group of folks in IT that like are so used to having these projects run over or go over budget or whatever else and know that nobody's setting the right expectations that they've just thrown their hands up. And so I think that the digital literacy component is so closely tied to cultural change that has to happen. And I don't think that the cultural change to be accepting of transformation can happen until you have that education of what is possible, what are these tools, how do we think through it, and how do we set our projects up for success.
That makes sense. So we've seen within the customers and whatnot that we deal with that a lot of times the executives, as you mentioned, they don't have that understanding, but they've heard enough buzzwords, probably read enough marketing literature to get a feel for this sounds like it's a slam dunk because all these three companies or five companies or whatever they've seen, they basically wave their hand and magic happens and out comes the other side of it. So there's maybe a false perception of that. How does an organization who has really smart people who are in the midst of that organization, they're not at the bottom, they're not at the top, they're somewhere in the middle, kind of managing change and managing these programs. How do they bubble up reality to help guide these executives who are sponsoring their programs?
So it's a sticky spot, and I actually will talk I've talked about, like, the unsung heroes of the middle a number of times because they're the ones that sometimes are getting those unrealistic expectations handed to them, and then they're expected to manage the change with their team, and then they get feedback and frustration from their team up, and they try to shelter from the executive level because they don't want them to feel like the project isn't going well or things are falling off the rails. So it's a really tough spot to be in. I would say the biggest advice that I would have is leaning on your partners to have them help you with that education process, both above and below. And I say that from the standpoint of having been one of those technology like partners and having conversations with people that are situated in that spot of my executive team doesn't understand how big of a lift this is going to be for some of the people that are doing the work day in and day out. It'd be like, okay, great. So the next time that we have a meeting, let's focus some of our effort on change management. Or let's have a conversation about setting some time aside with your team for a conversation on the art of the possible. Or can we come in and teach people about AI? And can we help with this piece of the puzzle and working with that? And that's, I think, probably if I were to distill it down, it's finding the right partners to help along the way so that you actually have the opportunity to have that back and forth and get the support that maybe you need that you don't have internally. And the other reason that I would say that, and I used to say this all the time, was like, let us be your voice because we're going to say the exact same thing that you've said 10 times. But because it's coming from someone outside the organization, there's no political dynamic surrounding it or any of the other things that happen when somebody inside the company says something. So use that and play that dynamic and those partnerships the right way so that you can help get that message across.
I was in management consulting in my early career, and certainly that was something I experienced day in and day out, where if it came from somewhere outside the organization, they put a lot more weight on it, maybe because they
Mhm.
paid extra for it. But the reality is that you do get that extra external perspective and perhaps a different way of providing that perspective that internal folks maybe can't do, maybe or as effectively as someone from the outside who's used to going into these kind of situations. Now, you mentioned a couple things. So we have the concept of this cultural change or the change from an organizational standpoint. You've got the changes related to teaching or providing digital literacy to your executives. In the meantime, we have massive changes in technology that are happening at breakneck speed. So with all those kind of change things put together, we start putting together these concepts of like digital labor, taking, you mentioned RPA and AI to put them together with this intelligent automation, creating this new digital workforce. Now these concepts become even more blurry because now we're stepping into the realm of where you'd hire a person to do something. Now you actually may need to consider, is this really a job a person should do, or is this a job that we can leverage some kind of smart labor to do to accomplish the same thing and maybe in a different way? Do you see executives being ready for this kind of hybrid approach of taking digital and human labor into a unified workforce?
But when I think that there's a lot of people, whether it's executives or really anybody in an organization, that might still be thinking through this equation of augmenting versus replacing or what that whole thing looks like in general. When I talk about artificial intelligence on platforms like TikTok, where people are not attached to an employer or they feel anonymous, they'll say exactly what they're thinking. And the amount of fear that's still associated with technology and looking at it as a replacement rather than something that augments or gives us the tools to reach new heights is still really high in, I would say, just like general population as a whole. And I think that executives then are really cautious of either making sure that they are not scaring their employees with it or still thinking that they can like reduce headcount massively by using these tools. And that's not to say that there isn't a way to become more efficient and do more with less throughout like using intelligent automation. But I think that we still haven't started to think through these platforms as tools. Like they're no different than a tractor that helped us. Like, and yes, and then when I say that, people are going to be like, "There's a lot less people working on a farm now than there used to be." But when I say we're not necessarily going to be replacing jobs the way that people think, our jobs have changed. So yeah, there might not be as many people out like working on the field because we've got these tractors now, but that doesn't mean that there aren't places for people to be productive elsewhere within our society. And I think that the rethinking what jobs look like in tandem with these tools is something that a lot of people haven't figured out. And I would say some of it is even in kind of the way that we've decided to kind of lead the charge with them. Like, we're going to put a chatbot on every website and we're going to automate every call center so that you, as a human, only ever interact with technology. That's a really bad idea because that's not how I want to interact with you as a person. Sometimes I do, but I also will get incredibly frustrated and maybe even leave you as a customer if there's no option for me to actually speak to a human. So, how can we use technology in a way that allows people to be human when they need to be and still offer those alternatives for that interaction, but then have the back end where there's a human available and have a partnership between those? And then when we actually get that, maybe we have that technology interface with like human to technology on the customer side. If they have to hit the exit button and go interact with a human, how is it integrated into the experience that your employee has so that when they get to the human, they're not completely redoing the entire interaction that human just had to have with the technology? And we're not thinking through those portions of it enough, I don't think, to feel like we've actually started to think through like where and how do we effectively augment. We've thought, aha, we can use a chatbot to manage communication because people want digital. No, people don't just want digital. People want you to use your tools effectively so that they can interact with you how and when and where they want to. And so that to me, I don't think we've fully clicked on that. And when I talk about this, I talk about it as looking at total experience as opposed to customer experience or employee experience. And how do we use intelligent automation and all of the different tools that we have at our disposal to improve the total experience as a whole to make our employees more efficient, change up the way that they're doing their job, but also improve the customer experience so that we have this augmentation and this seamless back and forth between human to human and human to technology.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And what resonates me is I grew up on a farm. So you talk about the changes with the tractors and whatnot. I'm no longer working on a farm. However, when I did work on a farm, the combine interface at that point was very much manual levers. These days, if you get into a modern combine, it's completely computerized. It's a
Mhm.
computerized interface that somebody has to really be educated for to be able to do it. So the transitions, even in something as simple as we would consider simple as farming, that there's been a massive technology change, even disrupting farming beyond simply saying, "Hey, we're not going to have people out in there with a hoe and a backhoe thing to, dig up the roots for the potatoes." Right
Yeah.
now, you have machinery doing all this stuff. You have machinery doing everything, and it's for our benefit because the output now is so much greater from that. But as we look at this, you also mentioned this whole seamless interface between humans and technology. And as I look at a broader viewpoint of an organization, when you start like looking at going to banking, for example, because it's something people can understand. I want to get a loan for my house. I want to refinance my house. And so I go to the bank for a loan. And that bank is going to now take my input now of what I'm going to send to it. And it's going to have a bunch of internal processes that it has to manage. Some of those are going to be people related in terms of my interface with the people collecting my information, perhaps some evaluating some of the nuances of my employment history or whatever the issues are. But there's a lot of external stuff that goes on too, related to connecting to a third party website for credit scores
Mhm.
or even better, a third party engagement you have maybe with someone who's an appraiser, something you don't have automated. So when you build all these things out, there's a whole kind of dance that happens within the process that some of it lends itself well to automation.
Mhm.
Some of it lends itself more to personalization. And some of it lends itself to this external kind of interface to components that may not even be in your company. So when you look at this kind of thing, what are your thoughts on this whole concept of this workforce orchestration? Are we going to see more of that because of the way we're seeing this new human and digital hybrid workforce?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a large part of it comes down to like how nicely technology tools decide to play with each other. And I don't know. had we been able to start from square one if everybody had open and available APIs ready to go and we could start there, like orchestration might not be something that we had to think through. But the reality of the world is that part of the reason that orchestration might have to take place is because that bank might have an old legacy system that's doing part of the lift. And they may have more modern tools that are a part of that process as well, but it's old playing with new, playing with people, playing with internal and external data sources. And again, if we were building from the ground up and we could like design, even in the scenario of like a brand new company that's building from the ground up, realistically, there's too many dynamics for it to be just like, oh, like APIs will save it all. And I think for a long time, we tricked ourselves into thinking that APIs would be the answer to that. And that if we had back 10 years ago, the integration bus that everything came into and everything went out of, that integration bus has now turned into orchestration because we realized that just simply having a spot where information came in and flowed in and out wasn't enough for us to actually get what we needed out of our solutions and build this like seamless path for our employees and our customers. So I do think we will see more of it. And I think it comes out of the like a little bit of the lessons learned or the realization that things that we think in theory are going to happen don't actually always happen in practice.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we start looking towards the future. Grab your crystal ball. What are the most exciting things on the horizon as we're talking about this whole amalgam of human and digital workers and magic happening in the middle?
Couple of things that I'm excited for. One, I think if we do it the right way, this will actually help us become more human again. And what I mean when I say that is I think there's been a lot of technology for technology's sake and like little bits and pieces that have popped up that are solutions that like solve a very specific problem. And they may solve that specific problem, but maybe it creates bottlenecks on the back end or causes a problem on the front end because of change in process or all of those different types of things. But even at the very bare minimum, even if it's just this solution that's solving a problem, a very specific problem, it's still a separate solution than the other five things that you have solving problems. And what that's done is it hasn't necessarily given us the outcome that everyone was promised of digital transformation. People were told, we're going to get rid of mundane work, we're going to automate processes, and things are going to become more simple for you. And what's happened is we now have more data and more information and more processes and more things that need to take place because we have more access to all of it. And I think what the next wave is going to be is how do we actually start to come how does that promise come due? How do we actually simplify things and make stuff less complex? And I think that like bringing in AI the right way, bringing in other emerging tools the right way gives us the opportunity to start actually automating all of those non-human things so that we can focus on being humans and getting rid of some of that complexity. So I am eager to see how we do that. But I think that's part of the reason that I talk so much about digital literacy. That's part of the reason that I talk so much about change management is we don't get to that reality that I would like to see if we forget that it's actually all about people. I love technology. I think it's really cool. I get very excited when I get to learn about new things and tell people about new things and teach them about emerging technologies. But at the very end of it, it doesn't matter what tools we're developing or what software we're building if we all end up in a world where it is doing everything. I mean, if AI is just interfacing with AI and we all have personal AI assistants that go out and interact with the AI that's at these companies and like none of us have jobs because AI is doing everything and we actually have no money to spend at these businesses that are being managed by I don't think that's a realistic like version of the history or version of the future for us. But we might run into bits and pieces of that becoming a reality if we're not cognizant and intentional about thinking about the fact that it's actually about humans.
Actually, I just want to know if my AI gets really rich, if it'll share some with me then.
Yeah, well, exactly. And what's your AI spending money on if it's not? And that's the piece that when you start to phrase it that way, of like, there are some people that truly believe that's what's going to happen. But realistically, even the companies that are just using AI all the time, no one's going to have any money to buy anything from them in the first place. Like that then the economy kind of collapses and we start from ground zero. So I think that there's this opportunity that if we do it the right way and we recognize that technology, our customers are people, the employees are people, our partners are people, everybody that is interacting with these tools are people. And if we use them as tools, we can reach completely new heights that we've never been able to before. The same way that if I didn't have my cell phone, I would probably not be able to do half of the tips that I need to mentally without having to like scratch out some math on the back of the receipt. And like that tool helps me do things that I couldn't do without it. All of these tools are going to help us solve more complex problems and figure out bigger things than we've been able to in the past. And so I have a very optimistic view of where we can go with technology, with the caveat that we have to pay attention to people along the way. And then my more local specific, like selfish thing that I'm very excited about is I am clearly a very verbal person. I talk a lot. I opt towards video because I like talking more than I like typing and writing and all of the rest of it. And so to me, it's really cool to see some of the advancements that are now happening from OpenAI, from a like voice interaction standpoint, and really being able to kind of take this technology that, for lack of a better term, has been used gimmicky. With I love my smart speaker. I think everybody's probably got one in every room in their house, but realistically, the technology is not overly advanced in terms of being able to take and run with your commands and do those types of things. And the way that we interact with technology in our personal lives is still, or in our professional lives is still predominantly focused on how the inputs that we're putting in. It's really exciting to me to see that voice technology and natural language processing converging with this Gen AI component that now might change the way that we interface with technology entirely. This little guy here that I've got might literally not be on my desk in 5 years if this advances the way that it could. And the way that my kids interact with technology is going to be drastically different because they're just always going to know interacting as if the technology was a human in the room. So I think that'll also be really cool to watch evolve and how that happens and how our interactions with technology as a society start to change.
I think you have a very interesting viewpoint on the future, and I hope your optimistic version comes true versus your we're going to all fail and AI is going to promote the economy version. But I appreciate your insights on both the technology, but also on the change management function and how important that is, because it is all about people. And if we keep that focus, I think we'll all be better off with everything we do, both in our professional and personal lives. So Ema, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insights. And I look forward to hearing from you more on LinkedIn and your other platforms.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C Blue Prism. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of intelligent automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.